Good evening, everyone. Bonsoir tout le monde. My name is John Young. I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. And on behalf of everyone here, welcome to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, your museum. This is one of Canada's national museums. And we're very pleased to be an institution that cultivates dialogue and reflection on human rights themes. One of the ways we do this is the sharing of stories and perspectives. We seek to expand our collective memory as Canadians, and I hope that's something we can accomplish here tonight. Black History Month presents a very excellent opportunity to celebrate the stories of Canada's Black community and to get all Canadians talking about Black history. And I'm just going to take a minute and highlight a few things that we're doing here in the museum. We're offering mini talks every Saturday afternoon in February. These talks focus on themes of human rights and discrimination in relation to the history of Black people in Canada. The museum has also published and shared a number of blogs about Black Canadians and human rights, both on our website and on our social media networks. In fact, I'm very happy to say that one of our blogs features an interview with Devon Clunas, who is joining us here this evening. Of course, it is important to discuss Black history not just in February, but every month of the year. And that's why the exhibits about Black history in Canada are a pivotal part of our core galleries. In our Canadian Journeys gallery, for example, you will find exhibits about the Underground Railway, the story of Viola Desmond and her struggle against segregation in Canada. You will also find digital exhibits inside the museum dealing with Black history. There is one digital exhibit about the history of slavery in what is now Canada. There is another about the lesser-known story of Black Sleeping Car Porters Union, the first union of Black men in Canada to sign an agreement with a white employer. Last but not least, there is a story about the tragic history of Africville, a primarily Black community in Nova Scotia that was demolished in the late 1960s. The museum also holds events connected to the stories of Black Canadians throughout the year. This past November, we hosted a moderated discussion on racism in Canada, both historically and today, via Skype. The museum brought two guest speakers to the event, Graham Reynolds, author of the book Viola Desmond's Canada, and Wanda Robson, Viola's sister. And that was a particularly great event. What was especially encouraging was the number of young people that showed up and engaged in meaningful conversation and discussion. It was also very inspiring to hear Wanda Robson speak about her hope for change. She ended up by saying, change is going to come, and we have to be patient, never give up. And then she repeated it again, never give up. I think sometimes as Canadians it's hard to know how change is going to come. I believe that Canadians can best move forward through respectful dialogue. That is why President Barnard's Visionary Conversation series is so important. It's a wonderful venue for important conversations in our community. So we're so pleased to work as partners with the University of Manitoba. The university, as you know, is a very vital resource in this province. It not only helps to drive the economy, but it cultivates ideas, discussion, and ultimately encouraging that kind of change that benefits our society. I commend President Barnard for this leadership and his commitment to the university as a nurturer of dialogue and discussion. And I'm looking forward to this discussion this evening, highlighting the experiences of a community that has been part of the Canadian story for hundreds of years. And so without further ado, I would like to invite to the stage President and Vice-Chancellor of the University of Manitoba, Dr. David Barnard.
Well, thank you, John, and good evening to everyone. Thank you all for coming. It's really a privilege to have the partnership that we do with the museum, and we really appreciate having the opportunity to meet here this evening. It's important to remind ourselves that history matters, that people's stories matter, and that we need to work hard to redress the errors of the past and move forward in a spirit of fairness and progress. That's what this facility is all about, of course. And we acknowledge that we're on traditional lands of Indigenous people. That also reminds us about the foundational place in our society of First Nations people. And it would be remiss of us as we gather today to speak about equality and inequality were we not to recognize the struggles this land's First Nations peoples are enduring, which have come into clear focus this week with the outcome of the trial in Saskatchewan. I'm sure that all of us feel that our hearts are with the family and the community of Colton Bushey. So I'd like to thank John and his colleagues for the productive partnership that we have between the University and the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and for hosting us here tonight. Themes of social justice and equity permeate the exhibits in this museum, and I suspect these are some of the themes that will be explored in our visionary conversation. Are Black Canadians equitably represented in positions of power and influence? I'm proud that the University of Manitoba has embraced Black History Month and is celebrating this important discussion, facilitating this important discussion. And I take on my role as moderator with humility. We've assembled 4 distinguished individuals to speak to this topic from their personal experience, and they have earned some authority. I often read at events like this from poetry and had intended to share a relevant poem with you this evening by the celebrated Canadian writer George Eliot Clarke. However, I found something recently that speaks more directly to the experience of Black Canadians living here in Winnipeg, and I'm going to read from that today. But by all means, seek out Clarke's work for yourselves. Stories can be found all around us, and this one comes from the Winnipeg Free Press obituary pages a few weeks ago. I don't know the family, nor the individual memorialized, Mr. Clay Lewis, but the piece, obviously written with great love by a family member, speaks movingly to the experience of Black Canadians in this city and across North America. I'll just read, I'm sure that many of you saw it when it appeared in the paper. I'll just read a few paragraphs from it. Our remarkable dad was born in Tennessee on September 18th, 88 years ago. Coming from a large family with 12 brothers and sisters, he was the last surviving member. He often talked about his days growing up in Memphis. Living next door to Graceland was quite a temptation for him. He said he was well known to the security guards there because he and his friends would often fence hop to play Nicky Nicky Nine Doors in an attempt to catch a glimpse of Elvis. Aretha Franklin was a neighbor, as well as a childhood friend of Clay's older sister. Family life was strict, as was the norm back then. College education was a given, and all Clay's brothers and sisters had a small percentage of any monies they received handed over to their mother in order to save for future schooling. Clay followed suit, obtaining his MBA from Morehouse in Atlanta in 1949, a year behind Martin Luther King. Although he only knew of Dr. King, he was friends with his future wife, Coretta Scott. It was also at Morehouse that Clay came across a recruiter who was looking for Black students to work in Canada for the summer as a Pullman porter for the CPR. This appealed to him because he was curious about this thing he'd heard of called snow. With Winnipeg as his home base, he soon saw plenty of that. Despite the fact that he was very far from the racial tensions of the South, he still experienced racism in Manitoba, but he was smitten with Canada. His work took him across Canada, where he fell in love with mountains. In 1948, he became a member of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, one of the first Black unions in North America. Up until its formation, porters were expected to work 72 to 100 hours straight, only allowed short cat naps when they could. On Portage Avenue, across from the bay, there was a Smitty's restaurant that was frequented by Black professional athletes. My dad talked of the days when he hung out there with CFL star Leo Lewis and many other ball players. It was their safe place. Dad once told us that he wanted his ashes spread in the Red River. I asked him why the dirty old red, to which he replied, "The red flows down to the Mississippi, which will take me home to Memphis." He said he didn't want a funeral, but more of a party like they did in my growing up days. Everyone would drink and toast to help them on their way, he said. I don't know, as I said, the family or the person, but this is really a compelling reminder of how each of our stories, although they're all unique and individual, also share many common elements. So let me introduce you now to our panel. First, we're honored to have with us someone who requires little introduction in this city, for most Winnipeggers would have seen him on the news or at charitable events across the city. So entrenched had he been in the local fabric as our chief of police from 2012 to 2016. He was the first ever Black Canadian appointed as a police chief, known for his focus on community relations and the need to address the social issues at the root of crime. He currently serves on the board of the Arthur V. Morrow Centre for Peace and Justice at the University of Manitoba. So with us today is former Winnipeg Chief of Police, Devin Clunas. Also here today is Leisha Strawn, an alumna of the University of Manitoba and currently an associate professor in the Faculty of Kinesiology and Recreation Studies. Having represented Canada herself in world athletic competitions, Dr. Strawn now focuses her research on positive youth and development in sport. She's also active as a coach, choreographer, and judge in baton twirling, and serves as director of the Anansi School, an arts-based group for children and youth promoting Caribbean and African culture. Another University of Manitoba alumna, Zilla Jones, is also with us. She has excelled in the legal profession, practicing criminal and human rights poverty law in Winnipeg through her own firm, Jones Law Office. Jones is also an assistant instructor for the Faculty of Law at the university and sits on the boards of the John Howard Society of Manitoba and the Manitoba Theatre for Young People. As an African-Canadian immigrant woman, she's keenly interested in issues of critical race theory and post-colonial theory and their application to the law. Finally, and also an alumnus of the University of Manitoba, we have Frances Amara, the model of an academic engaged in community outreach. Professor of biochemistry and medical genetics in the Max Rady Faculty of Medicine, Dr. Amara has a research interest in curriculum development and models of educational development. He's currently a fellow of the Higher Education Academy of the United Kingdom and leader of the International Network of Educational Development and Scholarship for Bioscience Researchers. In addition, he provides oversight and leadership for the Millennium STEM Center, an outreach project in Sierra Leone, West Africa. We also have numerous esteemed individuals in the audience tonight, members of the community who will be familiar to many of you, and they're certainly familiar with the issues under discussion, including Ms. Angela Cassie. I don't know where Angela is, but I know she's in the room somewhere. VP of Public Affairs and Programs. VP of Public Affairs and Programs at the Museum, who was honored at the December 2017 National Black Canadian Summit for commitment to human rights and rights of Black Canadians. Dr. June James, alumna and retired assistant professor at the Max Rady College of Medicine, past president of the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Manitoba, and former board of the Congress of Black Women. Ms. Alexa Potashnik, the founder of Black Space Winnipeg, a pro-Black grassroots activist organization. And Ms. Valerie Williams, the U of M's Diversity and Inclusion Coordinator. So we'll hear from them as well as a few other individuals throughout the course of the conversation tonight. I'll ask our panelists for their insights on the question of this session of Visionary Conversations. We'll then open things up to you, the audience, to pose questions and make comments. There are individuals with wireless microphones who will circulate for this purpose. We'll try to wrap up. We were going to wrap up by 8:30, but we were a few minutes late starting, so I'm going to try and steal 5 minutes more at the end to make up for that a little bit, if that's okay. Does anyone object to that? You can leave. Well, at 8:30, don't leave now. If you need to leave at 8:30, leave at 8:30, but we'll go for a few minutes past that. Okay, so let's begin. And I will first ask the panelists, do you think that Black Canadians are equitably represented in positions of power and influence, for example, in government and business in this country, in this province? And what, if any, examples do you have of prejudice you or someone close to you has experienced? Can I start with you, Devin?
Okay, there we go. Well, good evening to all of you. Very happy to be here with you. I would like to thank the President, the museum, for really engaging us in this type of discussion. Now, President Barnard, you mentioned the esteemed poet, George Eliot Clark, and I think I would just like to make reference that we do have a relative of Mr. Clark here this evening. A niece, am I mistaken? A cousin. Would you stand up, please, miss? Cindy Gallego. Ladies and gentlemen, Johnson. And so here it is. So when we received this request, my bride and I, Pearline, who's also here at the front, we typically now spend the winters in Florida. And so we were in Florida when we received this request. And in addition to the fact that it's Black History Month, I said to her, we have a responsibility. We have to go back to Winnipeg. And so we're back here because I truly believe we have this sense of responsibility and ownership, and I want to play a continuing role in our city. And so that is why we're back here. And I don't mean necessarily to answer your question with a question, but I thought there's a question that we need to consider as we dialogue this evening. How would you define Black in our current cultural context? And the reason I pose this question, as I said, my wife is here. She's fully German. I am Jamaican. And we have 2 daughters. And typically we'll get into this discussion and I will say, well, you're Black. And they were like, no, Dad. Like, I can't deny the German part of who we are. So they've determined that they're Jamaicans. But as we have this discussion, as we said, it's visionary conversations. I think truly we have to think about how are we envisioning the term Black. Do we mean typically people that look exactly like me? Or are we meaning people of different shades that encompass this all-inclusive term that we use as being part of the minority, the growing minority in our country? So what would you say? I think it's something we want to really think about as we dialogue this evening. Now, if you were putting this question to me back in 1975 when I first arrived here, or even 1987 when I applied to the police service, I would have emphatically said, no, absolutely not. We're not equally represented. And that response would have been a reflection of what I saw on television typically back then, how I often was made to feel at school, and what I typically saw within our own community, and my general lack of what I would say a sense of what the future held for me as a minority person in this country. Now, fast forward 30 years, I've had the experience of becoming the first Black chief of police in Canadian history, an incredibly fulfilling and rewarding career. I've been given the opportunities in this city and in this country to really sit in the seat of power, if you will, and to exert influence. And so over the period of time, my perspective has changed. Today, for example, when I watch television, I don't see individuals like me always playing the bad guys. It used to always be that way. I often see individuals like myself trying to bring order to society. And I see individuals who look like me in prominent positions of power and influence in the community, and we spend a lot of time, my wife and I, going to schools and speaking with kids. I see the changing face of our schools. As recently as today, when my wife and I went to a school to read to students. Now, the stats would tell us that absolutely no, Blacks are not equitably represented. But I think we need to immediately ask ourselves this. What has been the impact of that underrepresentation, if you will? To help myself with this, I thought about a number of trips we recently took to my home country of Jamaica. My home community still lacks many of the things that we take for granted. Electricity, running water, a sense of security. There is a significant amount of struggle right now in my country where most of the people in the positions of power and influence look exactly like me. So think about that in a Canadian context. I think for this generation of Blacks, broadly speaking, in Canada, the struggle really hasn't been that difficult as it was for those arrived here in the 60s or the 70s. And we've been able to forge ahead. I can certainly say that's been my experience. And I think there's a general sense of, well, all is well. And I think there's something that's really good about that. And so when you think about the lack of representation, could it possibly be it's simply because we have not had to struggle that hard? And what I'm meaning by this is that I say to my community, if there's a lack of representation, what can we do about it? Could this possibly simply be that we are living in a very good environment, and because we haven't had to struggle so hard, and because so many of us are doing well, we're not striving into these particular areas of power and influence? Having said that, I believe we're living in the land of opportunity, and it's incumbent upon us in terms of our community to determine that we are going to take hold of positions of power and influence. So here's an additional question I would ask us. When I look in our community, are individuals like myself doing enough to encourage the next generation? Are we doing enough to encourage the next generation to say that, absolutely, things are great for us here, but if we don't continue to advance, at some point, will we see the progress retreat? I'd like for us to consider all of those as we dialogue this evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. First of all, I am humbled and blessed and very honored to be able to be on this panel. And as a disclaimer, I am not an expert in Black history or in critical race theory, but I am an expert in my own history. And so I hope to share some of my experiences and stories with you tonight. You have to work hard. You need to work 2 or 3 times as hard as your white friends because you're Black. These words were a weekly anthem in our house as my brother and I grew up in Crestview. Oftentimes, we would look at each other and roll our eyes because the message was unrelenting from my mother. I'm so proud to be Canadian. I'm a first-generation Black Caribbean Canadian. My parents immigrated to Winnipeg 50 years ago this year, and there's a rich history of similar stories of immigration within our Winnipeg community. Our parents arrived with little resources, a strong faith, and resilience. They had to work so hard for any small gain, particularly in the workplace. As I've reflected on my own experiences in sport and in academia, I've found several parallels. Suffice it to say, I would not have a career in academia had it not been for my experiences as an athlete in the sport of baton twirling. I was the only Black child in my class for all of my elementary school career, and although I did meet other Black women and people of color in high school, I found myself as the only Black person in my graduating class from physical education and subsequently as an educator. I still attend the same church that I grew up in, and until recently, we were the only Black family that I would see. And as I go back to the baton context, you can imagine there were not too many Black baton twirling athletes representing Canada and Manitoba. I also was heavily involved in dance and in choirs here in the city. I was placed, whether intentionally or unintentionally, in many situations throughout my development where I was the only one. I think that because of this fact, I've become accustomed with this context. And my parents were more focused on providing experiences for us that would help us have opportunities to grow and to learn about ourselves. People might think that maybe I didn't learn about the Black experience enough in more white-dominated activities, but I think just the opposite. Each of these experiences allowed me to embrace my uniqueness and encouraged me to take pride in who I was as a Black athlete, singer, dancer, and colleague. Throughout graduate school and as I've begun my career in academia, I was and still am the only one. I did encounter another Black graduate student, I did not encounter any other Black graduate student at the institutions I attended. I'm the only person of color in my faculty, and notice I'm the only Black person in many sports psychology conferences that I attend. Even as I've had the honor of assuming an administrative role for a year in our faculty, I'm keenly aware of my only oneness at meetings and in workshops. So as I reflect on the question here tonight, are Black people equitably represented in positions of power? I have to clearly answer no, not in my experience. There are more and more Black international students on campus compared to my undergraduate experience at the University of Manitoba, but there is still an underrepresentation at the professoriate ranks, and this is supported by research. Are Black students not interested in graduate school or my field in particular? Maybe. But I find this difficult to conceive as I'm in the sport field, which in North America is arguably dominated by Black athletes. I think students need to see that there is a place for them in academia, and I do keep this in mind when I come across Black students, which is actually a rarity in many of my classes. Dr. Rose Chapatur-Thompson from the University of Georgia, a Kenyan scholar, visited our faculty just a few weeks ago. In her lecture, she made a reference to the nationalistic pride that is felt when we see our country's flag at an event, and I'm sure you're feeling this pride as we're starting to watch the Olympics. I think that this is akin to some of the same pride that we feel as Black people when we see others in positions of power. Sometimes it's important to be able to see yourself in order to have the confidence to strive. We need to be passionate about encouraging equity and equality if we want to build a better academic community at the University of Manitoba and also in our city. But as my parents cautioned years ago, we will need to work hard to achieve this. Although I have become somewhat comfortable with being the only one, I'm definitely ready for there to be many more. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. And I'd also like to thank Dr. Barnard for inviting me and the rest of the panel, and for my fellow panelists for sharing their insights. Very interesting thus far. Roxanne for her work in putting this together, the museum for having us here, and of course all of you for being here. And I also acknowledge that we're on Treaty 1 territory, the home of the Métis in Manitoba as well. So thank you all for coming. It therefore recognizes as inevitable and appropriate that the differing experiences of judges assist them in their decision-making process and will be reflected in their judgments, so long as those experiences are relevant to the cases, are not based on inappropriate stereotypes, and do not prevent a fair and just determination of the cases based on the facts and evidence. That's a quotation from the Supreme Court of Canada in 1997 from a case called RDS. And for those of you that aren't familiar with the case, it was a case out of Nova Scotia. There was a Black youth who had been accused of some incidents of crime. And when he went to trial, his judge was Judge Sparks, who was the first Black female judge in Nova Scotia, a province that, as we know, has a historic Black community. And Justice Sparks acquitted this young man. And one of her reasons was that she did not believe the police officers that testified. She believed him that he had been mistreated by the police, and she made a comment, in my experience, it's not unusual for police to take these kind of actions. The Crown was upset with that. They felt it was a biased comment, and they appealed. And it went all the way up to the highest court in the land. And ultimately, they found that this was not biased by the judge, that judges are entitled to bring their life experience and their observations to cases, and that this had not crossed the line, and that we should encourage judges to apply common sense based on their experiences. So, as you can tell, being a lawyer, a defense counsel in the city, I'm going to concentrate my remarks primarily on the legal profession, because that's what I know, and I don't want to talk about areas that I don't have a lot of experience with. And so what I did is I went to the statistics so we can see, not just in my opinion, but as proved by Statistics Canada and other institutions, what the facts are regarding Black individuals in the Canadian legal system. And the first place that I went was a 2014 study done by the Law Society of Ontario, formerly the Law Society of Upper Canada. And in their study, they showed that 4.3% of the population of Ontario as a whole identified as Black, such as African Canadian, African, or Caribbean. 2.9% of the lawyers in Ontario identified that way. Interestingly, in Ontario, 1.9% of people over 25 in the labor force were Black, and 0.8% of university graduates over the age of 25 in the labor force were Black. So there's quite a severe underrepresentation of Black people with university degrees in Ontario. And within that, there is somewhat of an underrepresentation of lawyers. But what was even more interesting was that there were only 2 Black lawyers in the province of Ontario who started practicing prior to 1976. There were only 13 that had started practicing from 1976 to 1985. But of those called to the bar between 2011 and 2013, there were 167. So while the progress is slow, the numbers are greatly increasing. Interestingly as well, 40% of Black lawyers worked in firms that had 5 or less lawyers, but only 22% of white lawyers were doing that. So the big law firms that make the big paychecks, Black people are underrepresented in those, whether that's by choice or lack of options is the question that they're still trying to figure out in Ontario. When we look at the judiciary, from 2010 to 2012, 100 federal judges were appointed, and that's across the country. Of those, 98 were white. Of 100 judges appointed by the government, 2 were Métis, and there were no other visible minorities or Aboriginal people. And of course, when we look at how judges get selected in Canada for federal appointments, it's done through judicial appointment committees. Who's on those? Senior lawyers. Well, we just saw there aren't too many senior lawyers of color, judges, there aren't too many judges of color, and then police and community representatives. So clearly there aren't a lot of diverse appointments coming out of these committees, and then that list is given to the government and they select from that. Of the provincial superior and lower courts, so these are ones that are appointed provincially rather than federally, the 2016 study showed that there were 2,160 of those judges across the country, 1% of them Aboriginal, 3% racial minorities in general. Now, if we contrast that with who's involved in the criminal justice system, in the prairies, 11% of federal inmates in penitentiaries are Black. 2.7% of the city of Winnipeg is Black, by contrast. 3% of the population of Canada identifies as Black. 10% of federal prisoners across the country are Black. And we know that this can come from policing issues. There was a recent study done in Toronto. 8% of the population of the city of Toronto is Black. 27% of the people carded by police are Black. Carding is going to bring outstanding warrants and other issues to light, and people are going to be disproportionately incarcerated as a result. The most interesting thing is that in 2016, 70% more inmates were Black than 10 years before in federal prisons. So from 2006 to 2016, there was a 70% increase in Black individuals going to the penitentiary. Now, what was interesting was that when this study was done by the Correctional Service investigator Howard Sapers, he wasn't looking for that. He was looking for issues of Indigenous over-representation in the justice system, which is also a significant issue. He was really shocked when he saw that the rates were higher for Black Canadians, and he did this report saying this population has been underserved. We haven't paid attention to it. We have ignored these issues. They found that there was over-classification of Black inmates as high security when they didn't need to be. There was more use of force on Black inmates than on others that did not need to be, and they were getting later release than others for no real justification other than their race. Now, when we come to Manitoba, we don't have the same statistics available that Ontario does. And some of us that work on equity committees with the Bar Association have been requesting that we do these, but Manitoba really hasn't been as comprehensive in looking at this as Ontario has. We do know in our city that nearly 1/3 of this city of Winnipeg is either First Nations, Aboriginal, or Black, 32.5%, but 17.9% of our police officers are racialized or Indigenous. Now, certainly in terms of Black lawyers, Manitoba is a fairly small legal community. I can probably count on my hands the number of Black lawyers in this city. I may be missing a few, but not that many. And we have just over 1,000 lawyers in Manitoba, so we're at not even probably 1%. We don't have any Black judges. I'm in court every day. I know all the judges. I know who they are. There are a handful of other visible minority and Aboriginal judges in the provincial court, the lower level court. There's none that I'm aware of in the Queen's Bench, the higher court. There are a couple of Métis judges on the Court of Appeal, but nothing else is represented there. So that is my answer to the question of whether there's underrepresentation. Clearly there is. In terms of personal examples, that's not something that I usually like to get into because I find that a lot of it is microaggressions and things that are very open to interpretation, then you get into, well, what if it was really this? What if it was really that? I know one experience that I think pretty much every minority lawyer has had is the experience of being mistaken for an accused person or not being taken as a lawyer, being asked if you're the secretary or something like that. And I know also that whenever that comes up, there will always be people that say, well, how do you know it's not just because you look young? Or how do you know that that doesn't happen to us as well? But that is certainly an issue. I know that when I was in law school in first year, U of M has this great program where law students will go to the law courts and shadow judges and see what they do. I was so excited to go do this in my first year of law school. And we go to this trial, and we're walking down the hall, and I see this black man coming towards me. He's wearing a suit and tie. He's carrying a package that looks like it has some papers, and I assume this man is a lawyer. So as he walks close, he looks at me and he kind of nods and smiles, and I nod and smile. I don't know him, but it's just a sign of respect that people will know that you do when you're raised as a minority. And then I hear it clinking, and I look down, and he's got shackles on his ankles. And I realize that this is the man that's standing trial for murder that we're coming to see, and he's not the lawyer. So my classmates look at me and say, you know that guy? You know somebody that killed somebody? Why are you talking to him? So that was like a really sort of little moment of cognitive dissonance. But it is true that I often do go to bail court and see names on the docket of people I know that I grew up with, that I went to school with, and they're accused now and they're in court for something. So that is difficult sometimes to see that when you know these people were smart, you know they had potential, and here they are looking at the penitentiary or jail. So certainly I think that we need to keep that in mind, that just in the criminal justice system, which is just one small piece of society, but it's such an important piece of society and has so much of an impact on outcomes, there is over-policing, there is under-representation, there is a lack of role models for people. Imagine coming to court to be sentenced and the judge never looks like you, your lawyer doesn't look like you, the prosecutor doesn't look like you. And how does that encourage people to have respect for the law and to want to do better in their lives? So we should keep working towards pushing those judicial committees to let people on there that are minorities and to start opening that up and look at that process and open it up so that we get a better representation. And I hope we'll talk more about that later this evening. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here today to share my experiences. And what I really want to talk about, as some of my panelists have said, the question of whether we've actually been represented equitably. That is one way of looking at it. And I think another way of looking at it, how far have we come and how far have we got to go? And I'll tell you a little bit, just a short story to put it into perspective. My kids don't really consider themselves black. I mean, this is a question, I leave this question every day for a very simple reason. And I know people are thinking, what? Your kids don't consider themselves black? I mean, you're black, you're standing here. Because I'm actually married to a Russian. Okay, so my children are biracial. And they were born in Canada here. And so this question of whether we are represented, how you look at yourself, whether being black or not, is something I live every day. And it's very interesting because my son is actually at the University of Manitoba. He's in the Department of Faculty of Sociology. So as you imagine, this is a very interesting topic in our house. And you know, today I was coming here and I was thinking, what should I talk about? Because my experience, my lived experience as a black, didn't actually start in Canada. It started in the United Kingdom. So my experience going back from Sierra Leone, a small West African country, a former British colony, going to the UK, it's where really my experience started as a black. And this was a period of Margaret Thatcher. I think most people are young here to know who the Iron Lady was. Okay, so these were very difficult times. So I've experienced being black in several dimensions. I've been called names, I've been told to go back. So my lived experience in Canada was really at a later stage in my development. Okay, I came here when I was already finished most of my higher education. I got married here, and now I have kids. So my experience might be a little bit different from somebody who were first-generation blacks in Manitoba. But when I look at this question and I go back, you know, I think I'm always I'm really always struggling with this question. Can you ever have in a human race where people are equally represented in all aspects or all sphere of life? The truth is, I don't know that answer. Okay. But what I know from my experience over the years, been 25 years now in Winnipeg, is that we've come a long way as black people. And the narrative of being black has changed. Because whenever you see issues that relate to black, let's say, for example, the Black Lives Matter in the US, it extends to the Olympic in Brazil. And when you see people on the street, there are a lot of white people actually more than black people. So I think this blackness, there's a global concept that is changing every day. But my daughter reminded me today that there have been changes. Whether I would actually achieve that absolute number where blacks are represented in position of power and influence that reflects the number of black people in the population, I think that is work in progress. And I asked her this evening when I went to take her from school, I said, are you going to did you celebrate Black History Month in your school today? She was not interested at all. She was more interested that there's going to be Valentine's tomorrow, which I actually forgot. And I'm actually in a little bit of trouble for that. So after here, I'm going to buy flowers for my wife. But what is really interesting, here was my daughter, born in Canada. She was not interested in Black History Month. And I said, are you not interested? She said, Dad, I'm interested. I said, we do this in social studies every week. Now, that is very important. The fact that actually Black history in Canada is now part of the curriculum right in elementary school, I don't know whether this curriculum in the university, was really a teaching moment for me. There have been changes. We still have a lot of work to do. And I'm hoping that with this panel and with the audience, we have an engaging discussion as how this concept of blackness has changed. I see it every day. I started teaching at the university 25 years ago. I'm one of the first professors to see medical students in the first week. And I have seen the faces of students change over the years. And I hope I can discuss my experiences and also how I live blackness through my family. Thank you very much.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for your directness and your openness and your strong words. So thanks very much. So now I would like to give an opportunity for each of you to participate. There are wireless microphones. People will come to you. And if you want to raise your hand, if you'd like to speak, we'll get someone to you with a microphone. And you can ask a question or direct it to one of the panelists or make a comment. Here in the front. Right down in the front here.
Okay, so my name is Sapphire, and my question or comment based on everything that was said and shared is that I can only speak from my own personal experience. I'm only 22, born and raised here in Winnipeg. My parents are from Jamaica, so I'm a first-generation Canadian. Part of this conversation, part of this question, are we equitably represented here in Canada? From what I know, we do have, Black history here in Canada, we do have a history here. We do have a place in here. However, our numbers, our demographics here have changed over the years. And you were talking about the changing narrative, right? So growing up, in my kindergarten to grade 5, I was the only Black kid in my class. Only Black kid in my class, only Black kid in my community, only Black girl in my neighborhood, only Black girl in that environment. However, now when I walk down the street, I do a lot of work in the inner city, and the numbers have changed. So in the last year alone, I can use the Boys and Girls Clubs for an example. Our demographic has changed from 60% Indigenous, maybe 20% newcomer youth, to a complete flip. So now we have 60% newcomer youth, Like, we're everywhere. There's Nigerians, Jamaicans, Ghanaians. We're all here, and we're all fairly a younger demographic that's come in or been born here after you guys have come. So the question of, are we equitably represented? I feel like there's a surge. I feel like you guys have paved the way. Our older generations have paved the way, created opportunities, taking up space in kinesiology in your faculties, in the police. We were here, and you're providing representation for us. We have 2 people studying to be lawyers right here. So are we equitably represented right now? Not yet. Can we be? I believe so. And the fact that we're having this conversation right here, right now, with over 100 people, I feel like we all crave that representation. We're all taking steps to make that representation possible. So I guess the question is, what are we doing to change the narrative about ourselves and to take up that space? And I feel like this conversation is one of them.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. Others? Down here in front, this gentleman?
Thank you. Thank you for having all of us here. My name is Gregory Liverpool. She would probably know me by any chance. Hello. And through cultural organizations, St. Vincent and the Grenadines Association of Winnipeg. To answer this question, I've been thinking about this question since I registered for this event a week and a half ago. And I think that the answer it all depends on what province that you're living in. Such as, let's bring it home to our province in Manitoba. Out of 56 MLA seats, there are 0 black male or female people in the legislature. There is 0 black male or female at Broadway on City Hall, where I will say one of the best police chiefs that we ever had butted heads on a yearly basis for police funding. The thing that I will say is that in terms of getting this power and influence is that we need to have a serious conversation, and I know that our Prime Minister Justin Trudeau raised this in a speech in Gatineau, Quebec, about getting black males and females to run for MPs and public office. And I think that we need to have a coast-to-coast-to-coast discussion in regards to democratic reform in terms of getting visible minorities to run. If you put the percentage of people who identify as black in retrospect in terms of the 336 seats that we have in Ottawa, we should have 9 MPs that are black. We only have 5. And all the 5 is either in Ontario or Quebec. Nothing in the Western provinces, excluding Hedy Fry, who's in Vancouver. And I think that needs to be seriously addressed, that's why I say I wish that we had people here from the political arena to address this type of inadequacy and injustice, and this needs to be fixed ASAP. And that's all I had to say about it. And as well as people with disabilities as well too, so.
Thank you.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. My name is Titi Tijani. I am the president of the African Communities of Manitoba. I've been here for over 30 years. I have my kids here. I raised them here, and so some of the issues that you all are talking about are part of my lived experience and also the lived experience of my children, being the only one from elementary up until high school. I'll piggyback on some of the 2 issues that you've raised and the gentleman over there raised. It's really important that we have representation. We need to have role models that our children can look up to and say, I want to be like that person, be it a woman or a man. I want to be in that profession. I like how, Devon Clooney wore his suit. I want to be a policeman. So we need to have role models, people that look like us in every walk of life, and especially at the top, so we can have role models. When you talk about the legal profession, yeah, you're right. Who do any of our kids look up to say, that judge, I want to be like that judge? There's nobody. Even in the police, yes, we do have some that are coming up, but we don't have anyone out there that we look at the TV, that we look at and say, oh, that interests me to be a policeman or a policewoman. I'm surprised at the kinesiology professor to say that you don't have black people, in the faculty. And that's really surprising when you have the percentage of blacks that are playing sports. But you know what? My kids played sports. And again, this underrepresentation is there. Because of the population, if your kid is not selected to be part of the All-Star or is not selected to go to that tournament, how can they shine, regardless of what they have? We've been to Canada Games, and I know there are kids that are able to bring medals home that are sitting in Winnipeg because of one reason or another. So the question to us is, what do we want to do about this? We need, some of us are aspiring up there, whether even if you're a manager in your work, place or in your walk of life, you need to be out there in the community to let these children see you. What is happening is that we don't go out. We stay home, we are so comfortable with whatever we're making, and we feel that the rest of the community or society don't need us. I see that a lot. That is something that I've been preaching. I talk to people, black people that teach at the university. We need to see you in the community so we can say, doctor this, doctor that. And our children can see you and say, oh, I didn't know he's a doctor. I want to be like that. So the question comes back to us. We need to be out there showcasing who we are, motivating the young ones to emulate us and get them away from the crime so that they don't end up to be those statistics that we're talking about. So when I know we're always eager and happy to say, yes, we're underrepresented, but yes, who do you blame? There's a blame on one side, but what are you doing about it? That's the question.
May I say something? I'd like to say something. I came here tonight hoping we'd see a bit of a watershed moment. There'd be a transformation, and the conversation would be exactly what young Sapphire was talking about and you're talking about. And that's what I meant when I challenged myself. I said, what are we doing? Because the doors are wide open. We live in probably the best city, wide open, where opportunities are here. And as a chief of police, I remember trying to pull our people in. There are no huge obstacles. We just need to go in and claim what is here. So I am with you 100%. That's how we go forward with this.
Other responses? Do you want to respond? Yeah.
We were told we can disagree with each other. I'm going to
Absolutely.
disagree,
Yeah.
respectfully. I understand what we're saying here, that there are some people that don't reach their potential. So I'm not disagreeing that does happen, but I think that we need to look at the systemic barriers as well. And I don't think that we can deny those. Even though they may not be what they were, they are still there. Just one example I can think of for law school. Part of the admission process is that you have to write the law school admission test. And there's been numerous studies on that test, that test has an inherent racial bias in it. Now, that's not to say you can't succeed. I wrote it, I did really well. I went to law school, there's many other people that did as well. But for some people, it is a barrier. The education you receive before you even get to the point of applying for professional schools, law school and med school. If you're in an inner city school that has less resources, less consistency, you're at a disadvantage. If you're coming from a home where it's not a stable home. There is a disadvantage. We know that there are groups that are disproportionately living in poverty in this city. So those are real issues, and they do affect people's access. So I think that it's a bit of both. We do need to encourage those that have the means and are able, and those of us that have children, absolutely, I have children, and I want to see them succeed, and I'm doing what I can to make that happen. But we can't lose sight of those that don't have what we have, aren't as lucky as we are, and need that extra help. So.
Yeah, if I can just step back all what we've said so far, and I get two things that are coming out here. Okay, the first is that the only thing constant in life is change. Okay? So in as much as we all agree there are systemic barriers, and I know this for sure, and just to highlight, for example, my son already goes to the health sciences. Okay, he knows the university, he knows my friends who are professors. So most likely, if he goes for interview, he has met different people. So he already has an advantage, starting. Okay, now. But the question also is this, as black people, or the concept of black, should we just believe that to achieve our numbers in society that reflects the number we have in population, it's a straight line effort logically, that just because there are more of us, therefore we're going to occupy this position? If we agree that there are systemic barriers, then that invariably implies that we cannot just do things because we are black, or we want to do something to prove something that we're black. It means we have to interact with other forces. It means we have to interact with other cultures, with a dominant culture, because you are not going to overcome these systemic barriers if you just look inward. So my message for young people is really very simple, okay? If you know that the only thing in life, or you accept this premise that is constant is change, then you should develop creative spaces for leadership. And I think this is what maybe my colleague there was referring to. We as a black community, we should provide leadership that transcends our community. Because if you show leadership in something that you're passionate, then you are going to cross cultures, let me say the dominant cultures that has all this advantage or favoritism. You cannot really exclude yourself if you want to overcome these systemic barriers. And I think that is some of the problems immigrants face when they come to Winnipeg newly. For several reasons, we come here from different countries, from the Caribbean or from Africa. It is very safe and secure to associate with our communities, with our cultures from different tribes. And that is okay, because there's a sense of safety. But beyond that, you really have to create leadership that you begin to interact with the Asian community, the indigenous community, the dominant white community. That's the only way you're going to achieve this representation in an oblique way. Okay? So in as much as we talk about blackness, in whatever sense we want to look at, we really have to cross and reach to other cultures. I always see as black people, particularly those of us from West Africa, whenever we have issues, whether there's conflict, there's civil war, we go to the dominant culture, and they are very, very generous. But when something happens to the dominant culture, I don't see black people there. So it's really a give and take, and that is what I'm really preaching to young people. They really have to go beyond their community, okay, in order to overcome these systemic barriers.
Alicia, do you want to weigh in? You don't have to, but if you want to.
I think I just want to respond to what you're talking about right off the top is the importance of seeing yourself, And I think I agree with what Zilla was talking about when she's talking about the barriers that do exist for young people and for young black people particularly. And I think, I've been reflecting a lot in the last month since I've been asked to do this panel, and I immediately was thinking, who do I know in sort of positions of leadership who I've looked up to? And I want to thank, and there's many of them here, elders in our community who have been just setting the way for us to, and lighting the path for us to have some opportunities and being sort of the first when they arrived here to do that for us. But I do think that we definitely need to be thinking about how we are how we are being able to see ourselves, or how the youth are being able to see themselves reflected when we think about positions of power. And going through education, I've spent a lot of time in school. I spent 13 years all the way to, and then another 7 years in undergraduate education, another 2 years in master's, another 5 years of PhD. I only had one teacher of color in high school, and to me that's like, so I try, I'm very mindful of that, teaching at university and being around people of color and trying to speak with them, trying to inspire them as much as possible, but I am keenly aware of some of the barriers that definitely they are experiencing in their own lives, and and I think we do have to think about what those solutions are, and I think they're there, but we just definitely have to sort of take hold of them and be more, I guess, forceful about what we want.
Yeah, David, let
Francis?
me just
Sure.
add on to that. I mean, one of the challenges of having role models from the black community is that right now there are very few role models. Okay, so if you assume that there are very few role models who are black, either they are doctors, entrepreneurs, or in athletics like Donovan Bailey and others, or Donovan sitting here, is that you cannot wait for that, which means you have to look for inspiration from people who are not black. I mean, when I was growing up in England, to become a scientist, my role models were not black. I've never had role models to look up to who are black. Okay? In my days, my uncle used to bring movies about Quincy. I don't know how many people have seen that movie, Quincy the that was my inspiration, to go into pathology, and that was my inspiration to be a scientist, with this view that because Quincy fought town hall or city hall, he proved how people were murdered, and he fights for the for the underprivileged. So that was my ideal of being black in England. So I had to look to white people as role models. So, so that is why I always insist. There are not many black role models now. The number is going to increase. So you really have to go beyond that sphere and look for creative leadership. So you don't have to, you don't have to look to black people as role models if they're not there. You can look beyond that.
Yeah, thank you. So lots of comments. Can I get up here on the third row back on the aisle? This gentleman.
Hi, my name is Mbuli. I'm from the U of M. I'm currently the finance director for the arts faculty and the finance director for one of the residence communities on campus. I'd like to confirm and object to some of the points that were brought forward today, respectfully. Some of them are why change is needed, how change can be brought about. In my opinion, very small experience being as young as I am, power and influence comes from opportunity. And a lot of black people don't get this opportunity because they're unaware. One of the biggest things that needs to be brought forward is awareness. So far, I've received 50 funding requests. 49 were from white people. And one was from a black person, and then when they say, oh, we don't get scholarships, we don't get bursaries, they ask, can you guys hear me? Oh, they ask, sorry, they ask, why don't we get the scholarships? Why don't we get these bursaries? Why are we not being involved, or why are we being excluded from the process? And it's because a lot of them don't apply, and it's because they're not aware. It is on us, youth, and the amazing people that have taken the time to come out to show people there's a better way. And that doesn't just mean black people, it means the white people, the indigenous people, anyone in a position of power or a position that can make change. I believe it's very important for everyone in our society to play their role. And that's why conversations like this is very, very important. So thank you for taking the time, everyone coming out.
Thank you. One more comment? No? Over here.
Oh, okay. Good evening, everyone. My name's Christine Volchak. Thank you for having me. I just moved to Winnipeg, and it's pretty cold, but nice. So I've noticed a lot of commentary on education, a lack thereof, a lack of knowledge, and my question, I guess, is really for you, Chancellor, because as a Jewish, Black, queer woman, I plan on applying here for school, and I want to say this without sounding rude or mean. Is there a lack of Black students applying, or is there actually just a barrier to the faculty letting Black students in? Because I think that there might be students applying. The people who are supposed to be mentoring them and letting them in might be using maybe diplomatic racism or moving the goalpost, or maybe they want to see themselves, and often I've looked through your faculty pages, mainly white, and especially with looking at your education page, I think that there's also a lack of maybe men, so there might be blanketed lacks of Black representation, Indigenous representation. So my question once again is there not students applying, or is there just a barrier to getting in?
Can I have my mic down just for a second? Can I turn? Yeah, thank you. I needed to clear my throat. I didn't want to deafen everybody. I can't speak to that statistically, so I can't give a definitive answer. I don't know what the percentages would be, but it's a very interesting question. I think that it's probably a combination of a number of the factors that have already been talked about here, whether people apply or not, whether they're well prepared when they apply. Exactly the kind of thing that was talked about with respect to the LSAT can probably occur in other places too. So I think that as a system, we need to learn better how to be more inclusive. There are probably barriers we're not aware of that sort that need to be pointed out, and there's probably more encouragement needed to have more people apply. But those are inferences. I don't know the answer with respect to the data. But I expect those are true.
If I could jump in, I think that's where we lack statistics in Manitoba. Yeah. So I don't know how much position the U of M is in to, I know it costs money to do these studies, but I think we in Manitoba don't really have as good data as other parts of the country. So I think that we don't really know what the high school graduation rates are and if there's issues there and those type of things specific to our city and our province. And that's what I found when I'm looking at this. It's really hard to answer these questions when you don't really know the facts on the ground. So I think that's important. Now we have the long form census back. Maybe that will help because there was a big gap there with missing information. And I think that's a critical piece of it is to know what the issues are so you can address them. And I don't think we do know that in this city as well as we could.
Right. So I think there's work to be done there.
Yeah. For sure.
Francis?
Yeah, I mean, from my experience, just looking at the Faculty of Medicine over the years, if I look at it 25 years, actually Black people are getting highly represented. I'll tell you that for a fact. Particularly the Nigerian community, we're getting a lot of Nigerian students doing medicine. When I was here 25 years ago, I would hardly see maybe one Black student in the Faculty of Medicine. Now I'm proud to say every year we may even have 3 or 4, which is, just looking at that particular faculty, we are actually overrepresented by our stretch of imagination. And I think that is actually going to increase because these Nigerian students are actually trying to go back into the community, to encourage more young people to go into sciences. And I was director for the Biomedical Youth Program for nearly 10 years. And I did approach a lot of African community. But again, I'm just one person trying to do that. So I think African students or Black students in the university should also take that leadership role to go into the community and really spread the message that I'm in university, you can do as well as I'm doing. The challenge for university is, we have so many other responsibilities. So it's not really possible for the university to address each and every demand that comes from whatever group. So therefore, university students, I really think, particularly Black students, it's their responsibility also, to inspire others.
I do think we have to be keenly aware, though, of the cost of education, the cost particularly to international students, and it's 3 times the cost. That's totally, or at least double the cost for international students to be at the University of Manitoba, and so I think we need to look there in terms of, and I know we have a lot of international students coming, and they're engaged and they're there, but I think just the cost even for kids in our community to be attending university, we really need to think about how we can be more helpful and more inclusive that way as well. And just to point to when Dr. Mara was talking about role models, I have to disagree a little bit in terms of looking to other cultures. We have such a rich history in our Black community across Canada and across the world. And as I teach the Anansi program, I teach young people every Saturday, and I have to kind of I've been looking and studying myself and trying to find more. I mean, it goes back for just a long, very, very long time. We've had Black people in Canada since the 1600s. There's so much history that we haven't, I don't think, covered enough of and celebrated enough in terms of Blacks in Canada. And I think we can use that to help inspire our youth. Like, they see that this has been done. Now it's for them for us to help inspire them as not just us as individuals, but as communities, as families, as cities. We need all the contexts in order to help build that development. So I have to say that those role models are there. We just need to find them. Like, they're there for us to research.
Thank you. Anything else?
Well, I could add to that quickly that it does make a difference. I read a study recently. I was going to use it in my remarks, but I didn't think I had time for it. But I'll bring it up now since we're on the topic. Sure. They just recently did a study. I think it came out of the U.S., but it was about Black teachers and the impact of having a Black teacher in the classroom. And they studied Black students who have had a Black teacher and Black students who have not had a Black teacher. And they found that the Black students who had Black teachers were something like 40% more likely to go into higher education. They were more likely to go into gifted classes. And when they looked at who gets selected for the gifted classes, the Black teachers were more likely to pick other Black kids than the white teachers were. So it's a positive and tangible effect that we see from that. And so it's not enough to just say, well, the white teacher can inspire you, because they don't. And the study shows that. Not to the same extent, I should say. Some do, obviously, some do. But not to the same extent. And there is an actual difference in the lives of those kids that you can track, and it affects their future, obviously, how far they go in school. So I think it is important that the community have its own role models as well as outside of the community.
I think it's great. It's great that we're having a wrestling match up here, because it's not that I'm disagreeing with you, so hear me clearly. Yes, it's important, but I think we have to deal with our reality. Myself, when I arrived here in 1975, I did not have a Black teacher, and thank God there was a white teacher who said, that little boy has potential, and they became my role model. So we can't, it's not one or the other. No, I agree, it's both. We have to realize we can be inspired by anyone here. I'm just looking for somebody with character. And earlier when I talked about the fact that doors are open, I'm saying within the city of Winnipeg, police service specifically, I know that they did everything they could to ensure that we have that representation. And class after class, even when I was a chief, it was difficult to get people, not because there were any systemic barriers. It's as you said, and somebody else mentioned, people within our community now need to go into our community to say the doors are wide open. Not that it's just fully open everywhere, but where there are opportunities, we need to go and seize those opportunities. So it's a combination of both. And I don't want us to think because we can't see a Black person in that role, we can't get there. We can.
Oh, yeah. Agreed. Yep.
Absolutely. This is good.
Agreed.
But I think it's certainly, there's someone with a microphone, there's a lady here in the front row. But if I could just make an observation, I think with respect to, just speak to what I know, with respect to higher education, it's clear that more people come to university from families that have had other people come to university than come for the first time, right? And I think there's just a lot of experience taking into account different factors, different social. I mean, I'm the first person in my family to complete high school and go to university, and it was an unknown thing. My children went, my grandchildren will go. It's different, right? But I think there's a lot of evidence that certainly in higher education, there's a lot of evidence that getting started makes a big difference for families, for communities. I think there are certainly some role models, but the pattern really matters. Yeah. So this lady in the front.
You're going to hold the mic? Oh, wow, thank you. Hi, everyone. Alexa Potashnik here from Black Space Winnipeg. I wanted to thank the panelists and everyone for showing your support tonight. I just wanted to take a couple moments of your time to maybe outline and help shape some of the discourse that's been happening tonight. And I think we moved from the question, are Black Canadians represented, to why aren't they? And getting down to the systemic barriers. And I do a lot of work. I've done a lot of work in the city and across the country, attempting to dismantle white supremacy, white privilege, male privilege, and some of the buzzwords I feel that were not discussed tonight, and the anti-Blackness of these systems. And with all due respect to people who have been successful, perhaps, in the system, we always have to keep in mind that Black folks have been exempt from Canada's narrative historically. And now we're starting to see movements such as Black Lives Matter and the work we're doing at Black Space across the country really come into this Black liberation that I feel so many Black folks are hungry for in this country, in this city, and that's something that Black Space manifested from. And speaking to also the panel representation tonight, which is rich, but also maybe in the future the U of M can consider Black folks who are from the queer community, who come from Afro-Latinx communities, who are Afro-Indigenous, and the very multi-layered and richness that comes from Black communities across Canada is very important to represent. And my dear friend Beatrice Watson here kind of brought up this biracial narrative that I've been hearing all night. I'm biracial, and I want to say something. My mom's Jamaican. She was born in London. My grandparents came here in the 1960s. My father's Russian Jewish, and I was raised by my mom. I say this all the time, it's a blessing to be raised by a Black woman, 100%. And I am the person I am today because of her. And there is this discrepancy all the time. I talk to other biracial folks, this fine line of Black and whiteness. And I have to say, from experience and from people I've seen, I identify as Black, although I still benefit from light skin privilege. I will still not go through some anti-Black racism that my mom will go through or not be able to understand that. So two biracial people need to be allies, two Black presenting folks. And that's a real important discussion when we're having about challenging anti-Black racism. But there is a story that always reminds me that biracial people, bringing it back to Blackness and unifying Black people across the community. In Chicago, and I forget his name, there was a young man who was killed by the police, and his mom was white, and he identified and he presented as Black. And the mom, for the longest time, thought, well, that can never happen to my son because he's half of me, he's half white. And the way we see race and perceive race in this country and historically is very important. And I think that coming from just speaking at a panel in Fredericton, we need to really mobilize as Black people, not just in Canada, but in Winnipeg. People have been coming to Black Space, asking us to do curriculum for schools. And the fact that institutions like I went to the University of Winnipeg and the University of Manitoba is not taking this into consideration speaks volumes. And for anyone who really wants to mobilize and come together as a community, I'm going to be here all night. And we're not going to end systemic racism tomorrow, but the less division we have amongst Black folks in this city is really going to shape the future and for future generations. And I just like to say, I have to acknowledge the sisters on the panel because y'all kept it real, and I so appreciate that so much. And it's amazing to see Black women taking over in this city and across this country. And thank you.
Thank you. Okay, lots of hands here.
I just wanted to.
Sorry.
I just wanted to address that quickly. Just in terms of the whole biracial issue, I'm also a mixed person. I don't like the word biracial. Everybody's mixed, and I think the fact that we divide it, that one of your parents looks this way and one of your parents looks that way, well, you're mixed. Everybody's mixed, and any Black person that's been in North America for the past 200, 300 years is mixed. Okay, so everybody is. Some people might more visibly look a certain way than other people, but I think that part of how we need to think exactly is that we're all allies, we're all in this together, and not focus so much on who has like lighter skin or this kind of hair or that kind of, it's not relevant. And in North America, it's not really seen. I've had people, this is my sister-in-law, I've had people confuse us. And I know that the black people here, like, well, how could that happen? But to a lot of white people, they cannot tell the difference. And that was shocking to me that, like, that people have said that, and the same for me and other people. So really, they're not seeing the differences that we think we can see. And that is an issue within our community and not necessarily out there. So that's my 2 cents on that.
Daniel?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Chibo, and I'm from Nigeria. Historically, since we started identifying human beings based on their complexion as black or white or whatnot, the black identity and experience has sort of been associated with struggle. It's been a life of struggle. And much of what I hear from the two men on the panel is that we have to struggle more, that we have to work harder and take advantage of positions. And I'm beginning to wonder, when does blackness stop being encouraged to struggle and strive and do things that we don't tell other people, especially people in the so-called mainstream, to do? That's one. My second question is on representation. Much of, I think, and a part of what I heard seemed like when we are represented in positions of power, then it solves something. And I don't know how it does that. We had a president in the US who was identified as black, even though he shouldn't actually be fully black, right? But he was black. And in the 8th year of his tenure, I didn't see much of change in experiences of black people in the US. And I know it's not actually based on whether I don't identify as black. It's difficult for me to explain that my complexion isn't black, it looks brown, I think. But it doesn't stop the fact that if I'm going through the airport, most times the alarm thing there beeps and I have to be searched. It doesn't stop the fact that I feel always watched, and that the way I'm treated is different from the way people who don't look or who don't have my complexion are treated. So it's not based on my choice. And my question is, how does representation matter? Does it really matter? Or are there structures of power that we have to be addressing and not based on representation? A friend of mine used to say that usually when we talk of representation and multiculturalism, it's this poster thing in which you have, black people represented in posters, and that solves problems. Thank you.
Who wants to respond to that?
Yeah, okay,
Francis?
I'll take it, David. One of the things I always think about, I engage myself, I always tell me talking to oneself. If you want power, then somebody has to give you power, okay? And we live in a real world that is highly competitive. There are other cultures. There's the dominant culture. And I always think, the way I think about it is this. We're all humans, but what makes us different is the context. Okay. You take some people here, anti-black racism or racism against other cultures. When I go back to my African root, we have tribalism, okay? You have dominant tribes that hold onto power, but the same very people, when they leave Africa, they come to England, the UK I always relate to. Suddenly they see racism as a problem. But they have been practicing this right back home within different tribes, okay? So it's really, talking to that young man, whether representation matters. There's always a struggle between different cultures, whether it's color. For me, it's not really important, okay? You have the dominant culture. They have their own children who are working very hard. for few places that we have in academia, just as an example. So when you change the context, then you begin to understand bigotry, racism, or prejudice. So the way I deal with that is I always consider myself as I'm human, I have frailties, I have my own biases, okay? And I always try to reflect. Whenever I go through the airport, somebody tries to search me just because I'm black, or they turn my passport over and over. I've experienced that. I've experienced it every time I'm going for conference. But what I always try to think is this: there are always goodness in people. Even your worst enemy, even the worst racists, there are always goodness in them. And I always try to look for that. That if I would have changed that context, what will I do? Okay? So I'm always reflecting. I call it the pendulum of talking to myself. I'm always trying to look at situation. Is this person really racist? Am I also racist? Okay. I think we all are. Just as we're all mixed in one way or the other, I think we all have these tendencies. It's the context that changes who we are. So I always try and pendulate between how I feel or how somebody is treating me. That is how I rise up to these occasions. Yeah.
To build on that, I think one of the points is that many minorities, and black people in particular, and other minorities as well, are not part of the established networks and customs and sort of avenues to get opportunities. And so that can be part of the context. I went to law school here, and there were lots of people in my class whose mom and dad were a judge, or their grandfather was a judge, or their uncle was a partner in a law firm. And in fact, at the end of second year law, there's the big hiring blitz where people get their articling positions that you need to get called to the bar. And pretty much everyone in my class who had a parent in one of the big law firms in the city got a job at the big law firm in the city. And most of these people were white individuals that had that. So, as we said, when a door's open for you, you open it for other people. Everybody does that, that's human nature. But when the dominant people doing that are not your culture, it can be harder to get to know those people. I think that's where the mentorship comes into play, because perhaps when there is a black lawyer at that firm, they are going to maybe give a leg up to an otherwise qualified black student that they meet. So we don't have those networks. And I know, for example, with the judiciary, to go back to that, there was a time when there were no female judges. And that was a big issue for women, that why aren't there any female judges? So the women judges or women lawyers actually mobilized and started nominating people and going to people and saying, put your name down to be a judge. And they said almost every woman they approached was like, oh, I don't know if I'm good enough. I don't know if I'm ready. Like, I haven't been a lawyer long enough. No, you need to put your name down. And when people started putting their name down, they got picked. And then the judiciary actually got to a point that it was 50% female. And it's now starting to slip back a bit. But it's having people open those doors and make those networks. We as people of color don't have that kind of mobilization or networking to get into those positions. So can we do that? Can we start doing that? How do we do that? I think that's important part of the context as well.
And just to add to that too, I was reflecting actually this morning. I don't know if anyone caught on CBC this morning, on CBC News, Dalhousie University has a search going on right now for a vice provost student affairs, and they have put in their job ad that they want someone of color or Indigenous, and no one else is permitted to apply to that position. So I think, that's revelatory, and Dalhousie University has made a sort of a commitment. They decided that they want to have people of color in administrative positions at university, and they're making steps to do that. And I think I think that's something that we have to reflect on and think about, and it comes to that, nominating or thinking of people who might be able to take those positions and be in those positions, so that those positions can be filled by qualified people of color, Indigenous peoples.
They also have access programs for people that wouldn't otherwise be able to go to university. It's called the transition year program. So they take people out of high schools that don't qualify for university, that are Indigenous or Black, and they give them a year to get their academics up to speed to go to university, and they pay all your living expenses, everything during that time if you're in the TYP program. And they also have what they call the IBM, Indigenous Blacks and Mi'kmaq program in the Dalhousie Law School, that is seats reserved for Black and Mi'kmaq people. So Dalhousie does a number of things in their community with their university. I know U of M does have some Indigenous access programs, which is great, but we have our president here. Maybe there's a need for some more programs for that for visible minorities and newcomers and first-generation students that are from other backgrounds as well. So that's something to throw to the university to think about.
Thank you. Friends, we've come past the time that we invited you for, and I have a very strong feeling that we should stop when we go past the time, because some people make commitments to be here and then to be somewhere else. So let's draw this to a close. There's still people who want to have conversations. I'm sure that that members of the panel would be willing to talk to you. We're living in a very interesting, in some ways frightening time. I don't know how many of the rest of you are as captivated, almost addicted to the spectacle of what's happening south of the border as I have been. But we see things happening that we thought were gone from our collective experience, and they need to be gone. We've seen recently in Canada just this decision about the Colton Boushey case and the response of the broader community to what the justice system needs to be something that's appropriate for all of us. And certainly this discussion tonight has been, I think, a very straightforward, forthright. I appreciate the work of the panelists. Thank you all for preparing to be here. And thank you for your candor. And to those of you who participated from the audience, thank you for your candor. I appreciate it very much. And I would like to thank again, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and also Winnipeg's Black History Month Celebration Committee for working together with us on this project. As always on these events, I encourage you to visit UM Today, part of our which is accessible from the university's webpage for a recap of this evening, and there will be a video posted on the U of M's YouTube channel in the coming week. So again, I want to say thank you to all of you for coming and for the vigor of the conversation, for all of you who participated. And I apologize to those of you who are frustrated, but we made a deal for a certain amount of time, and we've come to the end of it. Thank you very much.